So we're now on the top of Daf Beis Amid Beis. And the Gemara is talking about a bird by the name of Api Debar Yochli. And this is a very large bird which has a very large face. So the Gemara answers Tofasta Meruba lo Tofasta, Tofasta Bua Tofasta, that you should always take the lowest shear. So the Gemara asks for Ika Ema Ka'api de Tzirta de Zutartuva. Right, there's a bird which is very, very small and has a very small face. How do you know that the word Pnei Kapores refers to the face of man, which is as large as a tefach? Maybe it's the face of a small bird. So now the Gemara says, you know what? We have to figure out another way of figuring out what the word Pnei Kapores means. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Rav Huna says that we derive the size of the kaporos from Pnei Adam, Pnei Gomer. That's Xeret Shav. Ksiv Hacha, here in kaporos it says El Pnei Kaporos. Uksiv Hasam, when Yaakov Avinu receives the brachos from Yitzchak, and then Yaakov Avinu leaves the presence of his father Yitzchak, it says May Ace by Yotzo Yaakov, May Ace Pnei Yitzchak Aviv. So again we have the word Pnei. And therefore, we assume that the word Pnei means the face of man. And the face of man, in an average case, is one tefach. We never found the word Pnei anywhere in Tanakh with regard to the birds.
I think you said the face of a man is one tefach.
I guess it means from the eyes until the mouth is a tefach, on an average. I think. Yeah, I think it's the, Pana means the... Okay. Or it could mean it's a child, but not too young of a child, as we'll soon see. Okay. So the Gemara asks, "V'neilif mi panim shel malo." What about the Malachi Asharetz? The Malachi Asharetz have larger faces, and therefore, when it says panim, it says b'chsiv in a pasuk in Bereshis. It says kiros pnei Elokim v'tertzeni. This is Yaakov's meeting with Esau. And again, the word Pnei appears with regard to the Malach. And the Panim of a Malach is larger than a Tefach. Again, I've never seen a Malach, so I can't promise you, but then I'll rely on the Gemara. Tafasta Meruba lo Tafasta, Tafasta Bua Tafasta. So we're going to use the Pnei Adam because that shear is a smaller shear than Pnei Malach. So the Gemara asks, V'neiluf be kruv. Now the Gemara has a vested interest here to derive the definition of panim from the kaporos, the face of the kaporos. I'm sorry, from the kruvim, the face of the kruvim, because the kruvim were connected to the kaporos. So we're not stretching our arm out, to some foreign field. Now the Gemara thinks that the pnei hakruvim are smaller than a tefach. Amarav Acha bar Yaakov Gemiri she'ein pnei kruvim pchusim mitefa. We have halacha l'Moshe Sinai, an oral tradition that the pnei kruvim are not less than a tefa. Rav Huna nami mehacha gamir, and Rav Huna himself, when he derives the shear of kaporos from the word pnei with Xeret Shava, what he had in mind was the pnei kruvim, which again is local. And therefore, since the Pnei Kruvim, the minimum size is a tefach, we're not going to learn from Yitzchak, we're going to learn it from the Kruvim. Umay Kruvim, what does the word Kruv mean? Amrabi Abba Kiravya. This is the Aramaic word for a child, an infant, a newborn baby. It came with bubble, Korim Liyanuka Ravya. So it's very fascinating here that the word kruv, and this requires a lot of research, don't test me on this, but the word kruv seems to be derived from the word karavya. Now, kruv is in Lashon Kodesh, and kravya is not in Lashon Kodesh, to the best of my knowledge. So I don't know if you have, the one I would look in is Rav Steinsaltz, so anybody have, that's his specs, In any event, so the Gemara says, Amalei Abaye turns to Rabbi Avo and he says, Elameata, if you're right that the Pnei Kruv looks like a face, so then what are you going to do with the following pasuk in Yechezkel? This is called the Mara Yechezkel. And it says with regard to the 4 Kruvim of the Merkava that Yechezkel saw in his prophetic vision, it says that each kruv was made up of 4 different faces. The arba panim liechad, pnei echad pnei akruvu, pnei sheni pnei adam, and then pnei shlishi. Then it says shlishi pnei aryeh and revi pnei neshet. But all we have to focus on is pnei echad pnei kruvu, pnei sheni pnei adam. Now, according to your understanding, Rabbi Yavo, is hainu kruv, hainu adam. I mean, you said that the word kruv means the face of a tino. So you can't tell me that there are 2 different panim. One is a kruv and one is a human face. Why would the pasuk divide them into 2 categories if they're all the same? So the Gemara answers for Rabbi Avo, api Rabbi api zutra. That although in both cases we're talking about the face of a human being, but nevertheless there's a young human being and there's the older human being. And if you're talking about a tinok, that's called pnei kruv of a tinok. And if you talk about pnei adam, you're talking about a more mature face of a human being. So in the Merkava, 2 out of the 4 of the parts of the Merkava were panim of a human being, one of a face, the face of a child, and one the face of an older person. Now the Gemara comes back to discuss the minimum height of a sukkah. We said the minimum height of a sukkah is what? 10 tfachim, correct? And the Gemara now is assuming that when you have the aron, which is 9 tefachim, and the kaporis on top of it, which is another tefach, the total being 10 tefachim. And that sets up a rishus, and the sukkah has to be a rishus, and therefore it has to be a minimum of 10 tefachim high. So the Gemara now raises the following objection. You know, you want to set up a shear, a minimum height of 10 tefachim for the sukkah, and what you're telling me is that the empty space inside the sukkah is 10 tefachim, which means that the schach has to be above 10 tefachim. So the Gemara asks, how can you derive that from the Aron and the Kaporas? How do you know that when we say that there's a shear of 10 tefachim, which we need for a sukkah, you're going to say that that's the empty space without the schach? Ema, perhaps, bahari schachma. Maybe you need, let's say you had a schach that was 1 tefach. So you need 9 tefachim of space, of airspace, and then the schach itself will complete the size of a sukkah, making it a 10 tefachim high. And the reason why the Gemara is pressing this is because the aron, together with the thickness of the kaporos, which is 1 tefach, was all told 10 tefachim. So why not consider the kapores, which is the covering, to be parallel to the schach of a sukkah, which is the covering of a sukkah? And just like the thickness of the kapores of 1 tefach is mashlin the 10 tefachim, so too the schach could be mashlin the 10 tefachim of the sukkah. How do you derive from the aron and the kapores that the schach has to be above 10 tefachim and the airspace in the sukkah has to be 10 tefachim? And therefore, the Gemara wants to suggest another source from which we derive that a sukkah has to be 10 tefachim of airspace. Ella, let's derive it in Beis Olamim. Beis Olamim is the Beis HaMikdash that was built by Shlomo. And it's called Olamim because up until Shlomo Melech's Mikdash, all the other Mishkanos and Mikdashos were temporary. And after they were destroyed, there was what's called a Heter Bamos, but not with regard to the Beis HaMikdash of Shlomo Melech. So anyway, that's called the Beis Olamim Gamar. We're going to derive from Shlomo Melech's Beis Olamim. Now, this is very complicated because what we're going to do is we're going to try to figure out the height of the Kruvim in Shlomo Melech's Mikdash, and then from there, we're going to extrapolate the height in the Mishkan. So first we're going through Beis HaMikdash and then back to the Mishkan. It says with regard to the Beis HaMikdash that Shlomo built in Melachim Aleph Perek Vav. V'abayis asher bana Melech Shlomo Lashem shishim amma orko v'esrim rachbo. But what we're really interested now is the last 3 words. Ushloshim amma komaso. Komaso means the height. So the height of the Beis HaMikdash of Shlomo Melech was 30 amo. uksiv, and it says with regard to the kruvim in the Beis Hamikdash, Omas hakruv ha'echad eser ama v'chein hakruv hasheni. So the kruvim in the Beis Hamikdash stood on the floor as opposed to the kruvim in the Mishkan, which were on top of the Aron. But in Shlomo's Mikdash, the kruvim were actually on the floor, the ritzvas habayis, and the koma reached echad asar ama, and that means that the total height is 1/3 of the height of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, we'll work out the numbers in a minute. But anyway, Tanya, we have another brisa that says, "Mamad tzinu b'beis olamim kruvim shlish b'ayis." I know it says 11. I'll get back to that.
No, it doesn't mean 11. One of them.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you. Right,
Kruv echad.
You're right. I stand correct. So it means that they were each eser amma, and if the kruvim were eser amma high from the ground, and the entire height of the Beis Hamikdash was 30 amma, it means that the ratio between the kruv and the height of the Beis Hamikdash was 1/3. And now, Mama Tzinu b'Beis Olamim in Shlomo's Mikdash, kruvim shlish habayis heimomdu, is so too Mishkan nami kruvim b'shlish habayis heimomdu. The kruvim would reach 1/3 of the height of the Mishkan. Now we have to determine what was the height of the Mishkan. And this we know from the Krushim. The Krushim, a Mishkan Kamahavi, what was the height of the Mishkan? Eser Amos. It was 10 Amos high. Because the Pasuk says with regard to the Krushim, Eser Amos Orech HaKeresh. So the Krushim, the beams of the Mishkan, were 10 Amos high, on top of which they put all the curtains, the Urios, and everything else. So now we come to the conclusion that the height of the Mishkan was 10 Amos, right, equal to the height of the Krushim. Is Kama Havilu. Now let's take 10 Amos and convert it into Tfachim, right? There's 6 Tfachim in an Amma. Is Havilu Shitim Pushchi. Pushchi are Tfachim. So we have 60 Tfachim. Now we want to take 60 and divide it by 3 to get the height of the Kruvim. Is Talse Kamahavi. What is 1/3 of 60 Tfachim? Esrim Pushchi. Means you end up with 20 Tfachim. So what we derive from this is that the end of the 20 Tfachim at the Gova of the top of the Kruvim in the Mishkan. And from the top of the Kruvim, you have another 20 Amma to get to the top. 20 Tfachim, my mistake, to get to the top of the Mishkan.
Or 40. Oh, wait.
Just 1 second.
Above the arrow.
Correct. So we have a total of 30 amma, and we subtract 10 amma for the height of 1/3, which is the height of the kruvim. So from the kruvim until the top is another 20 tfachim. Okay, fine. Now, how do we derive this conclusion? Now let's go on. Now let's subtract from the 20 tfachim aseres di aron v'kaporos. So now we have from the kruvim, we have 20 amma, but now we want to subtract the height of the aron and the kaporos, which is below the kruvim, is pashulu asara. So it means from the top of the kruvim till the top of the mishkan is only 10 tfachim. Why is that? Because we have 10 tfachim from the ground to the top of the kaporos that cover the aron, that's 10 tfachim. We have 10 tfachim of the height of the kruvim themselves. From the top of the kruvim to the top of the aron was another 10 tfachim. We have 10, 10, and 10. And that means we've got now the 30 tfachim. So the Gemara says, "Uksiv, v'yu kruvim parsei knafayim milamala, sochachim bekanfeim ala kapores." So it means that the wings of the kruvim was stretched out above their heads, right? Above the kruvim. So we have now parsei knafayim. So we've got the aron, we've got the paroches, we've got the kruvim, and now we have the knafayim above the kruvim. The karmei rachmana schacha l'mala me'asara. And now the Torah considers those Shnafayim, those wings, are considered like schach because they cover what's below them. And that schach is above Asura airspace. We have above 10 tefachim. Why? Because we already calculated the 10 tefachim from the top of the kapores till the top of the kruvim. And now the kanfei kruvim, the parsei knafayim, were on top of the kruvim. So that means they were 10 tefachim above. So here we can learn that we need an airspace of 10 tefachim, and therefore the schach, which is now parallel to the parsei knafayim, has to be above 10 tefachim. You can't include the schach in the 10 tefachim. So the Gemara says, "Vidilma lahade reishayu kaime." Maybe, okay. Here I'm going to read to you a little bit from here. It's a little bit easier. Just give me a minute. So now we're up to second Dilma. One second Dilma lahadi reish raishayu aimo. Oh, I skipped a few words. That's my problem. Sorry, because it's published here on the bottom of my page in the Masechet. He says, "Ubimai digad finu iloi reisha kaime." How do we know that the wings of the kruvim were spread out above the heads, and therefore there was an airspace of 10 tefachim between the kapores and the knafayim? How do you know? What's your proof that the wings of the kruvim were spread above their heads? Maybe that's not so. Dilma lahadi reisha kamayim. Maybe the wings were spread like this, parallel to the heads. How do you know they were above the heads? Because you want to derive that if they were above the heads, then the schach also has to be above the 10 tefachim of the sukkah. Amrav Acha bar Yaakov lemala ksiv. The word is lemala, and it says v'hayu akruvim parsei knafayim lemala. If it was on the side, it wouldn't say lemala. So the Gemara asks v'yema de midlei tuva. But how do you know how far up they were extended above the heads? And now you're telling me that there was only an airspace of 10 tefachim. Maybe it was an airspace of more than 10 tefachim. Miksiv lamala lamala. It would have said lamala lamala if it was more than 10 tefachim high. The Gemara says, "Hani chil Rabbi Meir." Every calculation that you made reflects the shita that 6 tefachim makes an amma. Tiamar kol amos hayuvenin is that with regard to the Mishkan, all our measurements of an amma refer to an amma beinis. An amma beinis is made up of 6 tefachim, and therefore it makes sense that the requirement of the Mishnah of 10 tefachim can be derived from a height of the Aron and the Parochas. And above that, the Kruvim, as we explained, El Rebbe Yehuda, but Rebbe Yehuda disagrees. The Omar, although he agrees that Amma shel binyan shisha tefachim, as far as the binyan itself of the Mishkan, it is an Amma 6 tefachim, but nevertheless shel kelim, whenever the Torah describes the vessels of the Mishkan and gives us the measurements, then the measurement of an Amma is 5 tefachim. Michael and Mema. Now the Gemara is going to make the calculation according to Rabbi Yehuda that the Amma is only 5 tefachim rather than 6 tefachim. And we're going to end up with a much smaller shear for the sukkah. Aron v'kaporos kama havilu. According to Rabbi Yehuda, now let's calculate the height of the Aron and the kaporos. It's only tamya upalga. It's only 8.5 tefachim. And why is that so? So in the Masechet, he says the following. He says, Gova Aron Amma v'chetzi. Right? The Torah says that the height of the Aron is 1.5 Amma. Now, what's 1.5 Amma according to Rabbi Yehuda if the Amma is only 5? So 5 divided by 2 is 2.5, correct? So you add 5 to 2.5, you end up with 7.5 tefachim. Now add a tefach of the kapores, you've got 8.5 tefachim. So the Kruvim reached 1 shlish of the bias, which is, we said was 20 tefachim is pashalu chad srei upalga. Now what you're going to left with is 11 and a half tefachim under the kanfei akruvim up to the kapores. And therefore the shear of sochachim b'kanfei al kapores now is emo. We're going to come to the conclusion that a sukkah is ad havi chad srei upalga until the height of the sukkah is 11 tefachim and a half. So the Gemara answers, El Rabbi Yehuda, we have no choice. The Hilchasa Gemirle, he must have a tradition that dates back to Moshe Rabbeinu and Sinai about the shiurim of a mechitza, and he had the Kabbalah that a mechitza has to be 10 tefachim, and less than tefachim does not constitute a mechitza. The Amar Rav Chia, Barav Ashi, Amar Rav, shiurim v'chatzitzim u'mechitzim halacha l'Moshe miSinai. So the shear of mechitza is 10 tefachim by virtue of halacha l'Moshe miSinai, and enochinami. That's why a sukkah has to have mechitzos, and the mechitzos have to be a minimum of 10 tefachim high, and that fits into Rav's perspective that shiurim and chatzitzin and mechitzin are all halacha l'Moshe miSinai. So the next part of the Gemara really belongs to tomorrow, but I'll just introduce it. Shiurim da'oraisa minu. Are you telling me that shiurim halacha l'Moshe miSinai? I'm going to prove to you from a long brisa that all shiurim are derived from a pasuk, and therefore they don't need halacha l'Moshe miSinai. The chsiv, with regard to the shvach of Eretz Yisrael, the Torah says, Eretz. This is not this week's parsha, but next week's parsha. Eretz Chitosa or Rav Gefinu say Rimon. Eretz Zeis Shemen Udvash. Now every single word in this pasuk is going to teach me another shir. Amar Rav Chanin, Kol HaPasuk Hazeh L'Shiurim Nema. Each word in this pasuk is teaching me another shir. Chita L'Beis HaMenuga. The law is that if you walk into a house that was contaminated with Tumas Nega, then you have to remain in the house in order to be Tami the begadim that you're wearing for a certain shehiyah of a minimum amount of time. And the amount of time that you need is going to be derived from chita. It's called nichnas l'bayis sheyesh bo nega tzaras, whether it's adam, whether it's kalim, whether it's begadim, nidbar ha'erev. Ha'adam shenichnas l'bayis v'hu lavush begadim. If a man enters into a beis hamnug and he's wearing clothing, then we have to wait for a shehiyah in the bayis. So how much time does he have to remain in the bayis in order for his gadim that he's wearing to be contaminated with tumas tzaras? And the answer is, we're going to be meshayered with a chita. And what does that mean? This now we learned in the Mishnah Negoyim, anichnas beis hamnuga, the kelav munachim al kseifa v'sandola v'tabosa v'yado, hu v'hein tmeim miyad. He and his kalim, his sandolim, his tabos are all tmeim miyad. And why is that? Because he's holding on to them and he's not wearing them. However, with regard to the begadim that he's wearing, hayalavush kalim on the top of the vav, the sandola baragul, if he's wearing his shoes, the tabosa betzbos, he's not carrying his rings, but he's wearing them around his finger. In all these cases, it's a lavush who tamei miyad. He himself is tamei, but Haim tahorim anshi yishev b'bayis kedei achilas pras, and pras is a half of a loaf of bread, and that's called a muzzin of one seuda. A full pras, I'm sorry, a full loaf of bread is enough for 2 seudos, and he's got to wear the begadim while he's in the Beis Hamnuga for the period of time that it takes him to eat a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras. He can eat a kezayis in the time it would take to eat a half of a loaf of bread, and that bread has to be made of chita, of wheat. Paschitin v'lo pasiorim. Okay then, so we'll pick this up in Mitzvah Shem tomorrow, and everybody a great day, and thank you so much for joining me.